Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. How time controls inmates inside ADX Florence. Inside ADX Florence, time does not pass the way it does in the outside world. There are no normal mornings, no meaningful evenings, and no clear sense of when one day ends and another begins. Instead, time is engineered, structured, and enforced with precision. For inmates housed in America's most secure federal prison, time is not something they manage. It is something that manages them. Unlike traditional prisons where noise, movement, and social interaction define daily life, ADX Florence operates on a different philosophy. Here, control is not maintained through chaos or confrontation. It is maintained through predictability, repetition, and the removal of personal temporal awareness. Every moment is scheduled. Every action occurs within a narrow window, and every deviation from routine is intentional. From the moment an inmate enters ADX Florence, their relationship with time is fundamentally altered. There are no clocks inside the cells, no watches, no visible calendars. Days are not marked by events, but by procedures. Meals arrive at fixed intervals. Lights turn on and off at predetermined hours. Doors open and close according to schedules inmates do not control and are rarely informed about in advance. Time becomes something external, imposed rather than experienced. This documentary examines how time itself becomes a mechanism of control inside ADX Florence, not as an abstract concept, but as a tool deliberately woven into the prison's design. When individuals are denied control over their schedule, their sense of agency begins to erode. Decisions shrink. Anticipation fades. The future becomes vague, undefined, and distant. Over time, the mind adapts to waiting rather than acting. Waiting is one of the most powerful forces inside ADX Florence. Inmates wait for doors to open. They wait for meals. They wait for movement. They wait for instructions that may or may not arrive. This constant state of suspension alters perception. Minutes feel longer. Hours lose meaning. Days blur together. The absence of variation makes time feel heavier, slower, and more consuming. What makes this system particularly effective is its consistency. There are no surprises meant to comfort, only routines meant to condition. The predictability is not designed to provide stability. It is designed to remove personal control. When every aspect of the day follows the same rigid pattern, the inmate's internal clock begins to weaken. Without reference points, memory becomes fragmented. Time stops being something measured and starts being something endured. ADX Florence does not rely on visible force to achieve compliance. Instead, it relies on structure. Schedules determine when inmates move, eat, exercise, and sleep. Even moments of silence and stillness are regulated. The absence of choice gradually reshapes behavior. Inmates learn that resistance does not change outcomes. Only compliance aligns with the rhythm imposed by the institution. This approach has profound psychological consequences. Humans naturally rely on time to organize thoughts, goals, and identity. When time is stripped of flexibility, mental processing shifts. Long-term planning becomes difficult. Motivation declines. Emotional responses flatten. The mind begins to operate in short, repetitive cycles, mirroring the environment itself. Outside the walls, time represents possibility. Tomorrow, next week, next year. Inside ADX Florence, time represents continuation. The next scheduled event replaces the concept of the future. This shift changes how inmates think, remember, and perceive themselves. Identity becomes tied not to who they are, but to where they are within the daily schedule. This documentary is not about punishment alone. It is about design, how systems use time as a structural element to guide behavior without constant intervention. By examining daily routines and forced schedules, waiting periods, and the long-term effects of temporal control, we gain insight into how institutions can shape the human mind through repetition and predictability. As we move forward, we will break down how ADX Florence removes personal time awareness, how schedules replace autonomy, and how repetition becomes a silent form of discipline. This is a story about how time, when controlled by an institution, becomes one of the most powerful tools of confinement. The removal of personal time. Inside ADX Florence, The first thing taken from an inmate is not freedom of movement or social contact. It is something far less visible but far more destabilizing: personal ownership of time. Long before the psychological effects of isolation fully settle in, the inmate's relationship with time is quietly dismantled. This process is deliberate, systematic, and deeply embedded in the facility's design. Human beings rely on time to orient themselves in the world. Time provides structure to memory, expectation, and identity. We wake up at certain hours, anticipate future events, recall past moments, and mentally divide life into manageable segments. Inside ADX Florence, this natural framework is intentionally disrupted. Inmates are removed from a normal flow of hours, days, and weeks, and placed into a system where time exists only as an institutional function. The most immediate change is the absence of personal timekeeping tools. No clocks are mounted on the walls of individual cells. No watches are permitted. Calendars are either restricted or completely absent. Without these reference points, inmates cannot reliably determine the hour, the day of the week, or the passage of weeks and months. Time becomes abstract, estimated, and uncertain. This uncertainty is not accidental. When individuals cannot measure time independently, they lose the ability to anchor their thoughts to concrete temporal markers. The day no longer has a beginning or an end in the traditional sense. Instead, it becomes a sequence of events controlled externally. Meals arrive, lights shift, doors open and close. These events replace the clock as the primary indicators of time, but they are not precise enough to restore true temporal awareness. Over time, inmates begin to experience what psychologists describe as temporal disorientation. Minutes feel elastic, hours stretch or compress unpredictably. Without variation, the brain struggles to differentiate one period from another. A morning feels indistinguishable from an afternoon. Yesterday feels identical to today. The passage of time becomes something felt emotionally rather than measured cognitively. This loss of temporal clarity has profound psychological consequences. Memory formation depends heavily on time markers. When days lack distinguishing features, memories blur together. Events that occur weeks apart may feel as though they happened yesterday. Conversely, recent experiences may feel distant and unreal. This distortion weakens the mind's ability to organize experiences into a coherent narrative. ADX Florence's design amplifies this effect through consistency. Cells are nearly identical. Lighting remains controlled and uniform. Sounds are minimal. Visual stimulation is limited. Without changes in environment, the brain receives fewer cues to signal the passage of time. In the absence of novelty, the mind conserves energy by reducing attention to temporal details altogether. Inmates often begin to rely on indirect indicators to estimate time. The temperature of meals, the rhythm of footsteps in the corridor, or the sound of distant doors opening become improvised markers. Even these cues are unreliable. Schedules may shift slightly. Movements may be delayed. Meals may arrive earlier or later than expected. These inconsistencies prevent inmates from reconstructing a stable sense of time through observation. The inability to track time independently erodes autonomy in subtle ways. Planning becomes difficult. Without knowing how long something will last, it becomes harder to prepare mentally for it. Waiting becomes indefinite rather than temporary. This uncertainty increases psychological fatigue. The mind remains in a constant state of anticipation without resolution. In environments outside prison, waiting usually has an end point. A meeting starts at a certain time. A shift ends after a set number of hours. Inside ADX Florence, waiting exists without clear boundaries. An inmate may wait for movement instructions or access to basic activities without knowing when or if it will occur. This indefinite waiting reshapes how the brain responds to expectation. As personal time awareness fades, institutional time takes its place. The prison schedule becomes the only reliable structure. However, this structure does not belong to the inmate. It is imposed, inflexible, and non-negotiable. The inmate does not decide when to wake, eat, move, or rest. They respond rather than initiate. This shift alters the internal experience of control. When individuals no longer regulate their own time, they gradually relinquish responsibility for it. Decision-making narrows. Choices disappear. Life becomes reactive. The mind adapts by focusing only on the immediate moment, avoiding long-term thought patterns that no longer serve a practical purpose. This adaptation can appear calm on the surface. Inmates may seem composed, compliant, and emotionally flat. However, this calm is not peace. It is a survival response. The brain reduces emotional intensity to conserve energy in an environment where agency is limited. Time becomes something to endure rather than engage with. Over extended periods, the removal of personal time can alter self-perception. Identity is often tied to routines, goals, and future orientation. When these elements vanish, the sense of self may weaken. Inmates may describe feeling suspended, as though life has paused rather than continued. The future feels distant and abstract, while the present feels repetitive and heavy. Importantly, this process does not rely on physical force. There are no dramatic confrontations required. Time itself becomes a mechanism. By removing the tools needed to measure and control it, the institution quietly reshapes behavior. Compliance emerges not from fear, but from adaptation. ADX Florence's approach demonstrates how environments can influence cognition without direct interaction. The absence of clocks may seem minor, but its impact accumulates over days, weeks, and years. The mind gradually relinquishes its grip on time, and with it, a portion of personal autonomy. This part establishes a foundation for understanding time control inside ADX Florence. The removal of personal time awareness is the first step in a larger system designed to regulate behavior through structure rather than force. As we continue, we will examine how rigid schedules replace personal rhythm and how repetition reinforces this loss of temporal independence. Scheduled movement and behavioral conditioning. Once an inmate's perception of personal time has been stripped away, the next level of control inside ADX Florence is strictly enforced scheduling. Here, movement is not spontaneous, and daily activity is reduced to a sequence of predetermined events. Every step an inmate takes is accounted for, every routine is controlled, and every deviation is corrected to the subtle pressure of the system. This regimented rhythm reinforces the psychological control established through the removal of personal time awareness. From a moment an inmate leaves the intake area and steps into main corridors, they encounter a world governed by schedules. Corridors, recreation areas, and communal spaces are only accessible during precisely defined windows. Each cell door opens at a specific time, granting passage to the hallway for exercise, showers, or meals. These doors close again, often without warning, creating a rigid temporal structure that conditions the inmate's behavior over time. Behavioral conditioning through scheduled movement relies on a combination of predictability and restriction. Predictability ensures that inmates understand a routine and can anticipate when certain events will occur. Restriction ensures that they cannot act outside of the schedule, reinforcing the principle that freedom of movement is not theirs to claim. This duality shapes behavior without direct confrontation, as the environment itself communicates the rules continuously. Even simple movements, such as walking to a meal tray or lining up for recreation, are carefully orchestrated. Inmates are expected to follow exact paths, maintain proper spacing, and perform actions in sync with the schedule. Staff monitoring ensures compliance, but the emphasis is on creating a system in which the structure itself enforces obedience. Over time, the repeated exposure to these routines trains the mind to anticipate and respond rather than to plan or improvise. This conditioning extends to almost all aspects of daily life. Meals arrive at the same hour each day, often delivered through the small slot in the cell door. Exercise times are fixed, leaving no opportunity for spontaneous activity. Showers are allocated for specific intervals, and even periods of study or personal reflection must align with the institutional clock. The constant regulation of movement reinforces a sense of external authority, teaching the mind that all action must be mediated by the system. Psychologists studying this type of behavioral control describe it as a form of learned compliance. The mind naturally adapts to predictable, repetitive schedules, especially when independence is curtailed. In the absence of choice, the brain shifts focus from proactive decision-making to reactive management. Inmates learn to anticipate when the next door will open, when the next meal will arrive, and when they are expected to perform certain behaviors. Over time, compliance becomes internalized, even in the absence of direct supervision. Scheduled movement also has significant effects on perception and emotional regulation. By limiting the amount of agency an inmate has, the system reduces opportunities for frustration, rebellion, or initiative. The constant adherence to a defined schedule trains the individual to accept constraints as inevitable. Emotional responses that might occur in situations of uncertainty outside the prison are suppressed, as adaptation to the schedule becomes a survival strategy. Even minor infractions, such as arriving late to a designated area or straying from path, can result in temporary delays or reassignment to a different time slot. While these consequences are subtle and nonviolent, they reinforce the principle that timing is not under the inmate's control. The combination of predictable structure and subtle corrective feedback ensures that behavioral patterns gradually align with the institutional goals of control and order. Interestingly, the rigidity of the schedule also serves a cognitive function. By reducing variability, the environment channels mental energy toward compliance rather than planning. Inmates are preoccupied with fulfilling the immediate requirements of the schedule, leaving little capacity to consider broader plans or reflect on life outside the prison. This redirection of cognitive resources further reinforces the influence of external control on mental processes. The exercise periods provide a clear example of how scheduled movement shapes behavior. Inmates are allowed a specific window to walk, stretch, or engage in limited physical activity. These periods are short, often 30 minutes or less, and are strictly timed. Doors open and close according to a timetable that is not communicated in advance. The inmates learn to regulate their pace, actions, and interactions within these windows, internalizing the timing even when staff are not actively present. Meal delivery is another mechanism of behavioral conditioning. Trays are passed through cell door slots at fixed times. Inmates quickly recognize that meals do not arrive early, nor can they be delayed by individual preference. The schedule becomes a framework around which they organize other aspects of the day. The repetition of this process, combined with the absence of independent timekeeping, strengthens a cognitive link between external timing and personal routine. Scheduled movement also affects social dynamics, even in this environment of isolation. Inmates who share limited interaction spaces must synchronize their behavior according to the institution's timetable. Any deviation, talking outside of allotted times, moving too slowly, or breaking spacing rules can be immediately corrected. Over time, inmates internalize these patterns, coordinating their own behavior to comply with institutional expectations without the need for constant oversight. Long-term exposure to this level of behavioral conditioning creates a profound psychological impact. Inmates often report feeling programmed or locked into the rhythm of the prison. Time becomes measured in tasks and scheduled events rather than personal experience. Decision-making becomes simplified and reactive as the mind focuses on completing immediate requirements in alignment with the schedule. Personal initiative diminishes, and mental energy is conserved by accepting the external structure as reality. This conditioning is further enhanced by the absence of temporal markers outside of scheduled events. Without clocks, calendars, or external cues, the only reference to the passage of time is a routine itself. Each movement, each door opening, each meal delivery reinforces a structure, teaching the mind that compliance is synonymous with stability. Over months and years, this repeated exposure can alter cognition, perception, and emotional responses. In effect, ADX Florence transforms time into a disciplinary tool. By controlling movement and schedules, the facility exerts subtle but powerful influence over behavior. Inmates learn to live according to the rhythm of the institution, not their own instincts or preferences. The environment itself becomes an agent of control, enforcing compliance through structure rather than coercion. By the end of the first months inside ADX Florence, most inmates have internalized the scheduling system. The constant reinforcement through repetitive movement, timed meals, and regimented exercise creates a sense of inevitability. Resistance is not impossible, but it becomes psychologically exhausting and rarely effective. The institution has succeeded not through confrontation, but through the quiet, persistent power of controlled time and movement. Psychological influence. Repetition as psychological pressure. Inside ADX Florence, repetition is more than routine, it is a mechanism of control. Once inmates have lost personal time awareness and adapted to rigid schedules, the next layer of influence comes from relentless carefully designed repetition. Every action, every sound, every moment of the day is framed within repeated patterns. The effect is subtle but profound. The mind begins to anticipate repetition rather than events, and compliance becomes an almost automatic response. Repetition in this context is psychologically strategic. While the schedules themselves control movement, repetition amplifies the sense of confinement. It transforms the environment into a predictable, unavoidable cycle that inmates cannot escape. Unlike chaos, which might provoke panic or rebellion, repetition cultivates mental fatigue and passive adaptation. Over time, the constant recurrence of identical events reshapes thought processes, emotional responses, and even perception of self. Inmates in ADX Florence experience repetition in nearly every aspect of life. Meals arrive at exact intervals. Exercise periods are identical in duration, and the same doors open and close for the same events day after day. Even sensory inputs are repeated. The echo of footsteps down concrete corridors, the mechanical clanging of locks, the faint hum of fluorescent lights all reinforce the continuity of the environment. Over weeks and months, the repetition becomes inescapable, embedding itself in the inmate's awareness and subconscious. This unchanging routine has several effects. First, it reduces unpredictability, which in turn limits opportunities for independent decision-making. The mind becomes oriented toward anticipation of repetition rather than planning or creativity. Tasks are performed mechanically, and inmates gradually defer to the environment to dictate their behavior. Autonomy diminishes, replaced by a conditioned response to external cues. Second, repetition influences perception time. When every day mirrors the one before, the distinction between days, weeks, or even months becomes blurred. Without distinct experiences to mark the passage of time, the inmate's internal clock falters. Days stretch indefinitely or collapse upon themselves, and a week may feel like a single continuous loop. In this environment, time itself becomes a tool for shaping behavior, an invisible, persistent pressure that enforces adaptation. Third, repetition has emotional consequences. The monotony and predictability can induce a form of psychological stress. While not violent or overtly punitive, the endless cycle of identical actions creates a sense of stagnation. Inmates report feelings of mental numbness, decreased motivation, and a flattening of emotional responses. The mind, faced with constant sameness, begins to conserve energy by reducing engagement, leading to compliance through mental adaptation rather than coercion. Schedule repetition also reinforces institutional authority. By controlling which actions occur and when, the prison communicates that even the smallest aspects of daily life are under external governance. From the precise timing of a meal to the number of steps allowed in the corridor, the environment continuously signals dominance. Inmates internalize this dominance, learning that resistance is both futile and unnecessary. The institution has effectively converted repetition into a silent teacher of obedience. One particularly stark manifestation of repetition occurs during daily exercise periods. Each inmate has access to a specific slot time and a predetermined area. Movements are not freeform. They are constrained and predictable. An inmate may walk a set number of laps, perform the same exercises, or follow the same routine observed by others. Over time, the body and mind synchronize with this repeated pattern, internalizing constraints as natural rhythm rather than imposed discipline. Meals offer another layer of repeated reinforcement. Tray deliveries through cell slots occur at exact intervals, leaving no room for flexibility. The predictability of the schedule conditions the mind to anticipate and adapt. Inmates quickly learn to align their physical and mental preparation with these recurring events. The repetition becomes embedded in consciousness, reducing the effort needed to comply, and increasing the ease with which external authority is internalized. Repetition also extends to psychological cues beyond physical actions. Inmates become sensitive to subtle auditory and visual signals. The pattern of door locks clicking, the echo of footsteps, or the dimming and brightening of lights. These repeated signals reinforce the behavioral expectations embedded in the schedule. The mind begins to automatically respond to cues without deliberate thought, further consolidating institutional control. Importantly, repetition interacts with isolation and reduced sensory input to intensify its effect. Without varied social interactions or environmental changes, repeated patterns dominate perception. Inmates are confronted not with novelty, but with the exact same experiences repeatedly over extended periods. The result is a powerful conditioning effect that subtly alters cognition and emotional regulation. This mechanism is educationally significant as well. Researchers studying behavioral conditioning note that repetitive environments can accelerate habit formation, reinforce compliance, and even modify perception of time and space. In ADX Florence, the repetition is engineered deliberately. It is not incidental. Every repeated action, sound, and visual cue is designed to reinforce the structure of the institution and the adaptation of the inmate to that structure. Repetition also serves as a psychological anchor in a world without personal temporal markers. When clocks and calendars are absent, repeated actions become the reference points for measuring experience. Inmates unconsciously measure days and events based on recurring routines rather than objective time. This further enhances the internalization of the schedule and behavioral expectations imposed by the environment. While repetition can induce mental fatigue, it also provides a framework of predictability that paradoxically reduces anxiety about unknown variables. The inmate may feel powerless in broader aspects of life, but the predictable recurrence of events offers a structured environment that the mind can comprehend. This duality, control through monotony, creates both psychological pressure and a perverse sense of stability. Over months and years, the effects of repetition are profound. Inmates often report that days feel indistinguishable and routines dominate consciousness. Decisions are made automatically, emotional responses are muted, and internal focus shifts from planning to survival within the repeated structure. Repetition becomes a tool not only for compliance, but also for long-term cognitive reshaping. In conclusion, repetition in ADX Florence is far more than a mundane routine. It is a calculated, subtle form of psychological control. By embedding predictable patterns into every aspect of daily life, movement, meals, exercise, auditory cues, the institution shapes behavior, perception, and thought. Inmates adapt, often unconsciously, to the rhythm imposed upon them. Compliance emerges naturally from the environment itself, and mental energy is redirected from resistance to adaptation, waiting as punishment and psychological pressure. Inside ADX Florence, time is more than a schedule. It is a tool of control, and waiting is one of its most subtle yet powerful mechanisms. While many perceive isolation as the primary instrument of psychological pressure, waiting, imposed, indefinite, and unpredictable, is equally formidable. Through carefully engineered periods of inactivity, the prison transforms a natural human experience of anticipation into a form of discipline, shaping thoughts, emotions, and behavior over extended durations. The structure of waiting at ADX Florence is deliberate. Inmates are required to pause in their cells, hallways, or exercise areas, often for hours on end, before performing any activity. These pauses are not random, but strategically timed within the framework of the prison schedule. Movement, meals, showers, and recreation are all governed by precise windows. Deviations from the structure are rare, creating an environment where the expected and delayed are intertwined, producing a unique form of psychological tension. At first, waiting may seem benign, almost passive. Inmates sit or stand, sometimes staring at a blank wall, counting the minutes without clocks or reference points. But in this context, waiting functions as a constant reminder of external authority. The uncertainty surrounding when the next event will occur keeps the mind attentive, cautious, and highly responsive to any cues of change. The brain becomes trained to remain in a state of anticipation, linking compliance to survival. The intensity of the psychological pressure increases with the duration and unpredictability of waiting periods. Unlike conventional schedule outside prison, where waiting is associated with a fixed endpoint, ADX Florence manipulates the inmate's perception of time. A short delay can feel like an eternity, while a longer wait may blend seamlessly into the monotony of repeated routines. This elasticity in perception reinforces the mental dominance of the environment, conditioning the inmate to accept authority without resistance. Waiting also interacts with the lack of external temporal markers to produce temporal disorientation. When clocks, calendars, and external cues are absent, inmates are unable to accurately estimate the passage of time. Minutes stretch, Hours collapse, and days lose distinction. In this void, the only measured duration is the external schedule and the observable repetition of events. The mind's reliance on these sparse cues amplifies the effect of waiting, embedding the sensation of indefinite delay into consciousness. In practical terms, waiting is used during a wide range of institutional procedures. For instance, inmates may be required to line up in a corridor before entering a restricted area, remain seated while staff perform inspections, or wait for meals to be delivered through the cell slot. Each of these pauses, seemingly minor, accumulates into a persistent state of anticipatory tension. The body and mind remain alert, expecting movement, instruction, or activity at any moment, yet no immediate action is taken. This repetition reinforces patience, compliance, and adaptation to the prison's temporal authority. The psychological implications of waiting are profound. Human beings naturally plan, anticipate, and respond to expected outcomes. When waiting becomes indefinite or appears unchangeable, the mind shifts from planning to enduring. Motivation diminishes, emotional responses flatten, and cognitive resources are reallocated to simply coping with the passage of time. Inmates begin to experience a unique combination of alertness and passivity, a mental state finely tuned to the prison's structural demands. Interestingly, the prison's design amplifies the effect of waiting by limiting distractions. Cells are minimally furnished, sensory inputs are controlled, and visual stimuli are restricted. Without books, external sounds, or meaningful social interaction, inmates are left with few anchors for attention. Waiting, therefore, occupies the mental space entirely. The mind becomes hyper-aware of the passage of events and yet powerless to influence them, creating a persistent internal pressure that shapes behavior over time. Over extended periods, this strategy induces what behavioral psychologists describe as learned helplessness. Inmates gradually internalize the reality that they cannot influence timing, outcomes, or schedules. Resistance becomes mentally exhausting and ultimately ineffective. Compliance is reinforced not through overt threat, but through the internalization of waiting as a structural reality. The environment itself, through timing and repetition, teaches control more effectively than any direct enforcement could achieve. Waiting also plays a role in conditioning emotional responses. Frustration, anxiety, and impatience are natural reactions to delayed gratification. ADX Florence leverages these reactions by ensuring that waiting is unavoidable and recurrent. Inmates are confronted with their own emotions in a controlled manner, learning through experience how to suppress, adapt, and endure. Over time, emotional regulation aligns with the institutional rhythm, promoting behavior that conforms to the desired patterns of obedience. This system is further enhanced by integration with repetition and scheduled movement. Waiting does not exist in isolation. It is interwoven with the broader structure of the day. After a period of waiting, inmates may engage in movement or meals, only to return to another waiting period. The alternating cycle of activity and anticipation creates a rhythmic conditioning. The mind begins to associate pauses with compliance and acceptance, while activity becomes a limited reward controlled entirely by the environment. The cumulative effect of waiting on long-term cognition is significant. Inmates report distortions in temporal perception, difficulty maintaining focus, and reduced initiative. Time ceases to be a personal framework and becomes an external imposition, governing thought, action, and expectation. By leveraging waiting as a structural tool, ADX Florence reshapes the mental landscape, creating a population whose behavior is predictably responsive to schedules and routines. It is important to note that the strategy is silent, subtle, and nonviolent. There are no physical punishments required to achieve compliance. Waiting itself becomes the instrument of control, psychologically reshaping individuals without confrontation. The environment, the schedule, and the repetition converge to produce a highly efficient system of behavioral influence. Educationally, this illustrates a broader principle of environmental design. Behavior can be influenced profoundly through structure, repetition, and anticipation alone. ADX Florence provides a case study in how these principles operate in extreme contexts. The manipulation of waiting, when combined with removal of personal time awareness and scheduled movement, demonstrates that psychological control can be as powerful, and sometimes more so, than traditional methods of enforcement. The final aspect of waiting in ADX Florence involves its interaction with long-term mental health. Extended exposure to indefinite waiting periods can heighten stress responses, alter circadian rhythms, and modify emotional regulation. While the facility maintains medical oversight, the psychological impact of waiting remains significant, subtly shaping cognition and compliance. Inmates learn to endure prolonged inactivity, manage anticipation, and accept delays, aligning mental processes with the institutional design. In conclusion, waiting at ADX Florence is far from idle. It is a structured, purposeful, and relentless force that enforces obedience, shapes thought, and governs emotion. By carefully controlling the timing, duration, and predictability of waiting periods, the institution leverages one of the most subtle forms of psychological pressure available. Waiting transforms time into a tangible instrument of control, preparing inmates for the next layers of behavioral conditioning that structure life within America's most secure prison: sensory deprivation and the mind's response. As inmates progress deeper into the controlled environment of ADX Florence, another layer of influence emerges: sensory deprivation. Beyond the removal of personal time, rigid schedules, and repeated routines, the facility employs a subtle yet powerful control mechanism by limiting sensory input. Sight, sound, and touch are all managed, reducing external stimulation and reshaping perception. In this chapter, we examine how sensory deprivation operates, how inmates respond, and the long-term psychological effects of this environment. The architecture of ADX Florence is deliberately austere. Cells are sparsely furnished: a steel bed, a small desk, and a toilet. Walls are bare, unadorned, and painted in muted shades. Lighting is controlled to reduce variability, often remaining consistent throughout the day, creating a uniform visual landscape. Windows, when present, are narrow and barred, limiting exposure to sunlight and the outside world. This minimalism restricts visual stimuli, forcing the mind to focus inward. Auditory input is similarly restricted. Hallways are quiet, designed to amplify the echo of footsteps, distant doors, or the faint hum of electrical systems. Conversations are minimal, limited to brief exchanges with guards during scheduled activities. Radios, televisions, and other devices are rarely permitted. The absence of varied sounds reduces distractions, but also deprives inmates of auditory cues that help anchor their awareness of time, space, and social environment. Touch is regulated through routine and limitation. Beds are hard, clothing is standardized, and personal items are restricted. Inmates cannot modify their environment to suit comfort, limiting tactile stimulation. Even physical activity is constrained to designated areas and time slots. These conditions collectively diminish the sensory richness that typically supports emotional balance, cognitive alertness, and memory formation. The purpose of sensory deprivation is not to punish overtly, but to reshape cognition and emotion. When the mind receives fewer external inputs, it reallocates attention to internal processes. Thoughts, memories, and imagination become the primary stimuli. For some inmates, this can initially induce heightened awareness or introspection. However, prolonged exposure often leads to psychological strain, as the lack of external engagement challenges mental stability and emotional resilience. One of the most profound effects of sensory deprivation is its impact on perception of time. Without diverse sensory cues, the mind struggles to differentiate between moments. A morning can feel identical to an afternoon. Yesterday merges with today. Combined with prior layers of temporal disorientation and waiting, this contributes to a near-complete detachment from the external world. Time is no longer measured by external events or sensory change, but becomes an internal, subjective experience that can stretch, collapse, or lose coherence entirely. Sensory deprivation also heightens vigilance and responsiveness to subtle cues. Inmates become acutely aware of minute environmental changes: a footstep, a lock clicking, or a change in lighting. These subtle signals take on exaggerated importance, guiding behavior and shaping perception. The brain, starved of varied stimuli, reallocates attention to what little input remains, reinforcing hyper-awareness and compliance. The psychological impact is compounded when combined with isolation. Inmates spend long hours alone, often in small, enclosed spaces. Social interaction, which normally provides cognitive stimulation, is limited. Conversation with other inmates is minimal or absent, further reducing sensory input and depriving the mind of natural social reinforcement. This intensifies the effects of deprivation, creating a cognitive environment dominated by internal reflection, anticipation, and compliance with external schedules. Over time, sensory deprivation can induce changes in thought patterns. The mind, confronted with monotony and repetition, may produce vivid internal imagery, alter perceptions, or heightened emotional responses. Some inmates experience mental fatigue, irritability, or hallucinations. Others report increased introspection, philosophical reflection, or heightened problem-solving abilities, albeit within the confines of their environment. In all cases, the mind adapts to the constraints imposed by the prison, learning to function within a narrow sensory framework. Interestingly, sensory deprivation also amplifies the effectiveness of other control mechanisms. Waiting, repetition, and scheduled movement are intensified when external stimuli are minimal. A simple signal, a guard's presence, a door opening, or a mechanical sound, carries disproportionate significance. The brain learns to respond quickly and accurately to these cues, reinforcing patterns of obedience and attentiveness. In this way, deprivation magnifies the influence of every scheduled event and repeated action. The facility also leverages sensory deprivation to enhance institutional authority. By controlling the environment, the prison communicates that every aspect of experience is under its governance. Inmates cannot alter, escape, or distract themselves from these conditions. Autonomy is minimized, and perception is subtly reshaped to align with institutional expectations. The mind gradually internalizes these patterns, adapting thought and behavior to parameters of the environment. Long-term exposure to sensory deprivation also has implications for mental health and resilience. Inmates may experience anxiety, stress, or difficulty with concentration and memory. Circadian rhythms may be disrupted by uniform lighting and controlled activity schedules. Emotional regulation becomes a learned skill, exercised within the constraints of monotony and anticipation. While the institution maintains oversight and medical support, the psychological impact is profound and enduring, shaping cognition and emotional responses for months or years. Education and research into environmental psychology highlight the power of controlled sensory input in shaping behavior. ADX Florence's design demonstrates how limitations in sensory stimulation, combined with temporal disorientation, scheduled movement, and repetition, can effectively influence cognition and compliance without overt force. The subtlety of this approach makes it particularly effective. Inmates adapt internally, often without conscious recognition of the external pressures at work. Finally, sensory deprivation interacts with identity and self-perception. When external stimuli are minimized, the mind becomes a primary space of experience. Thoughts, memories, and imagination dominate consciousness. Over time, this inward focus can alter self-conception, heighten introspection, and influence mental resilience. The inmate's identity is simultaneously constrained and sharpened, reshaped by the controlled environment in ways both subtle and profound. In conclusion, sensory deprivation in ADX Florence is a critical instrument of psychological conditioning. By limiting sight, sound, and touch, the facility reduces cognitive distraction, amplifies behavioral cues, and reshapes mental and emotional responses. The inmate's perception of time, space, and personal agency is gradually altered, reinforcing compliance and internalizing the patterns of control established through prior mechanisms. Combined with previous layers, removal of personal time, scheduled movement, repetition, and waiting, sensory deprivation represents a sophisticated, nonviolent method of managing human behavior in one of the most secure facilities in the world. As our journey through ADX Florence draws to a close, it is clear that the prison's control mechanisms extend far beyond walls, bars, and physical confinement. The environment itself is a meticulously constructed system designed to shape the mind, the perception of time, and even the experience of reality. Through layers of removed personal time, strict schedules, relentless repetition, indefinite waiting, and sensory deprivation, the institution exercises an unparalleled level of psychological influence. These strategies, while subtle, are profoundly effective. Inmates quickly learn that autonomy is limited, that the rhythm of daily life is dictated externally, and that compliance is not just expected. It becomes second nature. Every sound, movement, and moment within ADX Florence serves as a signal, a cue, or a reminder of the overarching system of control. The human mind, exposed to these pressures for extended periods, adapts, internalizing the structures imposed upon it. It is important to remember that the methods employed are not physical punishments alone. The true power of ADX Florence lies in its ability to manipulate perception. Time is altered, routines become ritualized, and the mind's attention is guided toward compliance. What may seem like monotony or isolation is, in reality, a highly sophisticated psychological strategy designed to reshape behavior and cognition from the inside out. While the conditions may seem harsh, they also serve an educational purpose for those studying human psychology, behavioral conditioning, and institutional design. ADX Florence provides a unique case study in how environment, structure, and sensory control can interact to influence human behavior. By understanding these mechanisms, we gain insight not only into extreme correctional facilities, but also into broader principles of human adaptation, resilience, and the subtle forces that shape our perception of freedom and control. Through this exploration, we also see the importance of mental endurance and awareness. Inmates exposed to prolonged isolation, repetition, and sensory restriction must develop coping strategies to preserve their mental health. This includes focusing on internal reflection, creating mental routines, and finding ways to maintain a sense of self amidst pervasive control. These lessons, while born from confinement, illustrate the remarkable adaptability of the human mind under pressure. For viewers, the story of ADX Florence is both a warning and a lesson. It reminds us of the profound effects that environment can have on behavior, cognition, and emotion. It challenges us to consider how freedom, time, and sensory experience shape our own lives, and how easily the mind can adapt to constraints when external structures are both pervasive and subtle. As we conclude, the final thought is that control is not always overt. Often, it is the unseen, the habitual, the repeated, and the regulated that exerts the greatest influence. ADX Florence exemplifies this principle, a fortress not only of steel and concrete, but of time, repetition, anticipation, and controlled perception. Every action within its walls is measured, every sensory input is curated, and every moment serves a purpose in shaping human behavior. Thank you for joining us on this detailed exploration of ADX Florence. We hope this documentary has provided a deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms at play, from the strict schedules to the subtle pressures of waiting and sensory deprivation. Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding the intricacies of such institutions allows us to better appreciate the delicate balance of freedom, control, and resilience in human life. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more in-depth explorations of institutions, human behavior, and extraordinary stories from inside some of the most secure places on Earth.